Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. You all hear me? Yeah. Excellent. So to briefly introduce myself, my name is Andy Chang. I'm the president of the Economics and Finance Society. I'm a senior majoring in finance and Spanish literature. Thank you again for coming out, faculty and students, for a very special event today. We have Dr. Milanovic here to speak to us. I would like to briefly introduce my executive board, who works very diligently to make this all happen. Our treasurer, Victor Villalpando.
Hey there, everybody. I'm Victor Villalpando. I am a junior finance major here at St. John's, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming out to this event.
Savannah Atkins, our vice president. And Javier Borjas, our secretary.
Hi, everybody. My name is Javier, and I'm a sophomore finance major. Like Victor before me, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today.
Who's worked very, very hard to make sure the logistics of all this happens, and happy to report that everything's running smoothly with all the moving parts we have here today. So thank you once again for coming. At the Economics and Finance Society, we really do strive to bring a lot of different events to campus to provide students with the best opportunity for professional development, for learning outside the classroom, and it absolutely helps when you have such wonderful guest speakers like Dr. Milanovic here. We do have a lot of upcoming events. Next Thursday we'll be meeting in Merrill Act 328 at 2 p.m. as well. If you're interested in joining the society and being part of our mailing list, please see us after the discussion. We'll be in room 212, where there'll be some refreshments and beverages. So you're welcome to join us and sign up with us, and make sure that you're on our mailing list. Without further ado, Dr. Gevorkyan, if you'd like to introduce our guest speaker.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming here, first of all. And we have a very diverse group, so my students and I. First of all, but also we have students from other departments, other majors, and so on. And we have entire departments over here. Yes, today's talk is quite unique because it's rare that we are able to convince someone to make all the trip across Queens, right? Over here. It's quite a hassle. So we're really thankful to Dr. Milanovic for coming here. I will not take too much of your time. I just want to briefly read some of the key highlights from Dr. Milanovic's bio. Right now, currently, he is a presidential professor at the Graduate Center at City University of New York. He is also a senior fellow at Luxembourg Income Study. Those are the organizations here in the city, of course. He obtained his PhD in economics from University of Belgrade, working on income inequality in Yugoslavia. So that was quite interesting because he continued with this theme of income inequality, especially in transition economies, the Eastern European economies, all through his 20-plus tenure at the World Bank, where he was the lead economist in the research department. He's also a senior associate at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in D.C. and has taught at the University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins. As I said, his main area of work, Dr. Milanovic's main area of work and focus is income inequality in individual countries and globally. He's also looking at it historically. For example, the situation in the Roman Empire and Byzantium. More interestingly, in particular for St. John's, income inequality in the soccer area. So something in sports. He has a very long list of publications. I'm not going to read all of them, but just to mention some of the journals he's published, articles on methodology and empirics, global income distribution, and the effect of globalization in places such as Economic Journal, Review of Economic Statistics, Journal of Philosophy. I should also draw your attention to his recent book on the have and have nots. A Brief and Idiosyncratic History of Global Inequality, which was published in 2011 and translated in 7 languages. He's been selected by the Globalist as 2011 Book of the Year. He has a book that's coming up, that's a forthcoming book, titled Global Inequality, A New Approach for the Age of Globalization, which deals with economic and political issues of globalization, including redefinition of goodness cycles, which I guess we'll hear slightly a bit about today. And the book is scheduled to be published next year. So, judging by the silence, I guess let's just sink in. We have a speaker of very high caliber, and we would like actually to have this more of an interactive engagement. So we'll allow our guest to present his views for another 30-40 minutes, but then we would expect some questions. And I'm sorry, but students take the priority. So first questions will be from students. So try to think, pay attention, take notes, and what would you like to ask? And then, of course, as a benefit, there is food and drinks that are coming up, but not in this room. So to find out where, you have to stick around. Okay, so without any further delay, please welcome Dr. Milanovic.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It is a pleasure for us to be here. As Alex said, it's not very hard actually to come from downtown New York to here, so I'm not really very far physically. And I would like to thank Andy and the Economic and Finance Association for inviting me. I would, as Alex said, actually I would speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. I think it's very hard to listen to anybody for longer than that. And it is a very big topic. You know, I've sent here lots of slides, so I'm not going to go through all of them because I think many of the issues maybe which I would leave sort of out may be brought up by students or by faculty in the Q&A. I would prefer actually that you guys keep the questions for maybe the later part, because there may be lots of questions in between, and we will never actually come to the end of my talk. So I think it's better to keep it for the end, for the period of Q&A. Now, let me first say, actually, as Alex said, I'm going to talk about income inequality. It's important actually first to mention that it's income. It often gets confused or mixed up with wealth. Wealth is different. Wealth is actually what economists call a stock variable, which means I ask you today, like, how much are you worth? What are your total assets, your total debt? It's like, we know about your wealth in that particular moment. Income is what people call a flow variable, which means it's basically your wages, income from, capital that you might own, then social transfers, then you deduct direct taxation from that and so on. So it's basically, we're talking about a period, because obviously if I ask you what is your wage income this month, it's going to be different from like whole year. So it's a flow variable. There are many more studies, and there is much more data about income inequality than wealth inequality. Simply because, surveys which actually collect data on income have very long history. They go back, to 1950s, 1960s in most of the countries. For example, if you look in the U.S., it's the current population survey, and you have micro data going back to 1967, but actual data go back to just after the World War II. And even if you go further back, for the U.S., you actually basically had the first survey, which was a precursor to the survey that I'm using, which was done in 1929, just before the Great Depression. And then we can have some guesses for the past. So I will be talking about that. Second thing, I'll talk about inequality. As you know, inequality is a very popular topic these days. So for some of you, you will actually hear what I have to say, but I would also say that if you plan to work on inequality, it's a huge topic. What I would actually cover today is really a tip of the iceberg, because I would talk about, global inequality. I would talk about what happened in the world over the last 25 years. But the topic itself is really huge, because you can actually study inequality in individual countries. You can study issues like gender inequality, racial inequality, inequality between the countries. You can study political philosophy issues with inequality. That's actually a very interesting topic. You can study migration, which is driven by differences in mean country income. So there are really many areas that you can study. And finally, to give you also a little bit of an encouragement, if you look for your future job prospects and other things, I can really be quite sure that actually this is a topic that is not like a one-off topic. It's not going to go away. The reason was that this topic was a little bit sort of left aside for many reasons that maybe we'll discuss later from the mainstream economics. But I think now it's actually getting in there. And I see that actually people are now writing textbooks. Actually, I've been asked actually to review 2 drafts of a textbook on inequality, which we don't have. Believe it or not, we don't have a textbook like for the undergraduate on income inequality or wealth inequality. And then, of course, many students are doing their research. So once it gets into the curricula and actually people start really working hard, I think it's going to be a topic it will be a topic that is going to stay with us for a while. Okay, after this kind of a general introduction, let me tell you what I'm going to basically talk about today. First, let me define. I have to start with all these boring definitions, but if I don't do definitions, then you will not know what I'm talking about. So, I first try to define income and inequality. Now I have to define the third word, which is global. Now, what is global income inequality? Global income inequality is, in principle, income inequality between or amongst all individuals in the world. Now, what does it mean exactly? The intuition is very simple. If I say, well, inequality in the United States went up. It's very clear. We all tend to think about nation state. That's what we are most interested in. But it's identical to talking about global inequality. It's simply that your field of interest as being rather limited to a country becomes global. So actually, when you talk about global income inequality, you take income of each individual in the world, technically, the same way that you take income of each individual in the U.S. technically into account. So that's global. Now, the next question is actually, where do data come from? I already mentioned that essentially the data that I would be using, which, by the way, if somebody asks me later, are different from the data that PKT is using, are data from household surveys. Household surveys are really the main, main block of, or main tool for figuring out what is happening to income inequality. They're essentially surveys, random surveys of households in a country. Like, for example, in the U.S., it's something like 100,000 households who are interviewed every March. And then people are asked, what is your income? They are not asked only one question, like, what is your income? They're asked because, you would get really weird answers to that. But you are asked, like, how much were your wages this month or this week? Then, of course, it's multiplied to put it in the annual level. And then all the other things. Have you received social transfers? Do you have, retirement income? Do you have income from, many other things like alimony, for example? Do you have income from dividends, interest, and so on? So that's where it comes from. Now, how do you get a global inequality? Well, only by really combining data like that from as many countries in the world as you can. But now, I was very lucky, actually, I alluded to that, as I was in the research department of the bank, which actually does that precise work on poverty. So maybe some of you have seen that now the World Bank poverty numbers have changed, like a couple of days ago. There is a new poverty line, $1.90 per day per capita, which used to be $1 in the past. So we actually, the World Bank is lucky in that sense that it has access to many household surveys, particularly from emerging countries or poorer countries, that you're not going to find on the internet, or that you're not going to find even if you write the statistical office. So that's how you actually get to the global income inequality, essentially by combining the surveys from many countries. I have also to mention, as you will see in a minute, that I'm talking really basically from the period from around mid-1980s to today. And it's very hard to talk for the period before using microdata, which means actual household survey data, because three big parts of the world were really not having household surveys. The first one is Africa, actually, which until mid-1980s really had very few countries with household surveys. That has improved, but Africa is still behind the others. Then the second one was the Soviet Union, which actually had surveys going back to 1920s, but they were not released, actually. The data were actually kept secret, so you could not really do anything. And the third one is China, that had surveys from like the early 50s, but then during the Cultural Revolution, there was an interruption. So the modern surveys in China started in 1982. So essentially, before 1985, approximately, or 88 in my case, you really cannot do sort of an analysis of global inequality based on actual data on households or individuals. You can make guesses, and of course I've made guesses for historical data, and of course other people have made guesses, but these are really educated guesses. You're not really working on household surveys. So that's one thing. finally, one question that everybody will ask me also is, you would say, well, how do you compare these incomes? You know, we all know that a dollar in the U.S. or the dollar in New York is not the same thing as a dollar in India or a dollar in Africa. Well, in order to compare that, you have yet another enormous exercise, I will not even talk about that today, is the so-called International Comparison Program, which produces so-called purchasing power parity dollars. This is so-called PPP dollars. And what it does, it tries to establish the price levels in all the countries. U.S. is used as a numeraire. So if the U.S. is 1, I mean, you will have an intuition that poor countries will have to have lower price levels, simply because food, for example, housing, services are cheaper in poor countries. And that means that once I get the data from household service from different countries, I would have to adjust them for the price levels. That means essentially that if you live in a poor country, you would actually get a boost because the price level that you face is lower. I mean, again, it should be something which is intuitive because, for example, if you live in, Tanzania or in India, I cannot impose to you prices from New York. That your income is going really to shrink and look very, you cannot survive. But I have to actually face you with prices that give you the prices that you actually face in your country. So this is all methodological introduction, but without that, it might not be at all understandable what I'm talking. So I hope you will probably ask me more questions during the Q&A period. Now, let's start. This global inequality has two components. Inequalities within nations that I talked about, like within the US, within Spain, within China. And I will talk a lot, actually, in my book, really spent lots of time about US inequality and Chinese inequality. And then it has the second component, which is inequality between mean country incomes. That simply means that when we say US inequality, US income is higher than in Mexico, we simply mean that US mean income or average person in the US is better off than average person in Mexico. So this is the second component. Mind you, that does not mean that everybody in the US is better off than everybody in Mexico. It simply means that the mean is higher. So let's start now building this global inequality. We'll start from national inequality. Now, as the title says, this is no surprise to any of you, inequality within countries in the last 25 to 30 years went up. And it's no surprise, and actually that's probably why many of you are here, other than those who really have to come here because you have to have it in, as part of your class. But many of you who voluntarily came are because inequality as a topic has become very important in practically all the world. And the reason why it has become important is because inequalities in most countries went up. And as you know, as the crisis struck, mean incomes were stagnant, or some cases declining, and inequality still kept on rising. Now, I'm using here, I'm not going to read all this slides, but I'm using the coefficient which is called the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality. And I have to mention it's inequality this measure. So if the coefficient is low, the extreme of being low is 0. That means that actually inequality is 0, which means that everybody has the same income. Obviously, that's a theoretical possibility. You don't have countries where it's the case. You don't have even communities where it's the case. And then the other extreme of that Gini coefficient is 100, which is also a theoretical possibility, where you have the entire income of a community in the hands of one person. So that also doesn't exist. But within that range, as the number goes up, and as you can see here on the slide, you can see that on average, these coefficients were lower in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s than they are here, than they are today. And if you look at the first line, it says the average Gini, that was actually you take the Gini of all the countries in the world that we have, 120 approximately, it went up from about 36 points to 38 points. US is above that level. US is about 41, 42 points to give you an idea, how you compare. Other countries, very unequal countries, like, I will show that in a second, in Latin America are at 55 or 60. So just to give you an idea, how is the range of that coefficient. Very equal countries are really at the bottom, in the lower 30s. So that basically, we're talking about the range from 30 to 60, so it doesn't go above that number nor below. And then, of course, I have different calculations here that you can actually do these Gini coefficients. You can weight by population, because high inequality in China is not the same as high inequality in Chad, simply because there are many more people. And then I actually can display on a, on a slide like this, where on the horizontal axis you have the Gini in the late 80s, and on the vertical Gini in 2008, 2011. And what you notice there is that actually there is this line, which is 45-degree line. So if you're above that line, you're actually more unequal today than you were in the past. And if you're below, you're less unequal today than you were in the past. And the size of these bubbles is proportional to the population. It's a long story, but China comes and India come under two different forms: rural India and urban India, and rural India and rural China and urban China. Because the service in China are actually two separate services, for the rural areas and for the urban areas. And as you can see, actually, you can see US, China, Russia, Nigeria, India, all being above the line, meaning that inequality there went up. Then if you really go to the very high level of Gini, and you look actually, if you go all the way to the end, where the Gini is about 60, you'll find Latin American countries, and you'll find a very interesting phenomenon, which is very unique to Latin America, is that these countries are countries with very high level of inequality. But in the last 10 or 12 years, most of them, including Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, have had declines in inequality. So we have a somewhat interesting kind of development in the last 25 years. Practically all countries, some with low level of inequality like Sweden, some with medium level of inequality like Germany, some with relatively high inequality like the United States or China, have seen widening inequalities within their own nations. But a few countries from Latin America, which are very unequal and still remain very unequal, have seen a decline in inequality. So some people talk about convergence in the Gini, because the top most unequal countries are becoming less unequal, and those that are actually with low inequality, like Sweden, are becoming more unequal. It's an interesting topic. It has not received that much attention yet, because all these phenomena are relatively recent, but I just mentioned it for you, because some of you in your studies later might actually run it. Another sort of way to look at that is that actually you plot it on horizontal axis, you plot mean income adjusted for all these price levels between for each individual country, and then on the vertical axis you plot the Gini coefficient. And what you see is this kind of a somewhat U-shaped line, or actually flat and then declining, is what is called also the Kuznets curve. And I will not talk much about that because we don't have time, but it's one of the ways of thinking about inequality, which says, it was defined in the 1950s, which says that in countries which are relatively poor, or countries which were historically relatively poor, like suppose the United States in 1810, tended to have low inequality, then they would reach a peak of inequality. For the US, actually, it is considered that the peak was probably in the early 20th century, and then they would go down, and inequality would be, they would become richer and richer, and inequality would go down. Well, the problem, of course, with the Kuznets hypothesis is that actually the last 25 years have seen in most of the rich countries, as I said before, an increase in inequality. So there is an issue there with the Kuznets hypothesis that actually I write about, that Alex mentioned in my new book, but I will not actually talk about this here. And if you look at the picture of the world within that context, I have put different colorings for different types of countries. So start first with blue. These are rich countries, because as you can see, they're on the right end of this horizontal axis. So they're countries with high incomes of, GDP per capita in the US is over $50,000, and then West European countries about 35 or 40,000. And as you can see, actually, they are not, by world standards, they're not really unusually unequal. They are relatively, or countries of relatively low inequality, although as you might notice there, US is relatively high among them. So US is a little bit of an outlier among the rich countries. It's more unequal than most of the other rich countries. Then you have the green countries, and it's Latin America, which I already mentioned. As you can notice there, they are all above the goodness curve line, and they are all countries with relatively high inequality. In other words, the green countries, as you notice, are really above the blue countries, so they are more unequal. Then the red countries are so-called transition countries, and what is interesting about them, or actually formerly, communist countries, they really spend lots of the span of incomes that they have is very wide because you have relatively poor countries there, and you have countries that are in high middle income or actually rich. But there are still, with few exceptions like Russia and Ukraine, but there are still countries with relatively low inequality. So it is, although inequality in those countries, particularly the Central European countries, went up, it did not reach did not go over the OECD or rich countries inequality levels. So that's kind of a picture of the world. I don't have Africa here because Africa is very diverse. It generally tends to be very unequal, but the data from Africa are less good and it's very diverse. The same is true actually for Asia, because we have many more data. But Asia, which people forget, is a continent with very vast differences in mean incomes between the countries. You have really countries that are very, very poor, like, you take Burma, for example, or Nepal, and then you have countries like Japan and Korea that are very rich. So it's a very different continent. So now, let me, I have to now speed up things because otherwise I will, it will go for a long time, and I promise that I will not speak more than 30 or 35 minutes. So let me show you when we also talk about income, how policy matters. We have seen this increase in inequality within countries. And there are basically three exclamations that you can call it with acronym TOP. Where T stands for technological change. So people think that inequality in the US, look at this red line, that's inequality in the US, went up because there was a technological change which made people with high skills more valuable because they would actually be more apt and able to work with, having with sophisticated computers or machinery, and created the gap between the wages of highly skilled people and low skilled people. So that's the technological part of the explanation. The second part, which is I call under the name of O, like openness or globalization, tells the story of globalization where cheaper imports, for example, from China or elsewhere, or outsourcing essentially hollowed out the middle class in rich countries and increased the gap between the rich and the poor. So that's the second part. The third part, which people emphasize, is policy, where lower taxation on the rich people or lower taxation on inheritance, for example, increase the gap. So basically, you can actually, it's very difficult to tell how much of each has contributed to rising inequality. Of the TOP, but here what I actually use US and Germany is to illustrate the importance of policy. And I do it in the following way. Look at the red line. Red line, the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is still the Gini coefficient. The red line shows you inequality, which is this Gini coefficient that I talked about before the government redistribution kicks in. So it's basically what you get before government takes away some of your money for taxation, and before government gives you social transfers, like, social security, unemployment benefits, social assistance. So as you notice, this red line went up both in Germany and in the US. And actually in Germany, it even went up more than in the US. But then look at the blue line, which is really the line that we are most interested in. This is the income, inequality of income that you at the end have after you have received your market income from your job, for example, and government has taken all your taxes and given you back the benefits. And as you notice that US blue line has risen much more than the German blue line. And the reason there is that the U.S. redistribution system has more or less remained unchanged as the red line, which means market income inequality, went up. So essentially, what you can imagine that the government is some kind of a distribution machine. And if this machine works at the same level, whereas the underlying pressure of inequality increases, then obviously the blue line, which is the ultimate result, is going to increase as well as the red line, or more or less the same. But if this redistribution machine works harder and redistributes more, as is the case in Germany, then the blue line is going to increase less. So the whole point of this, actually there are 2 points there. The first one is that you will find the same results, and it's actually from the Luxembourg Income Study Center. You will find the same results for all rich countries. This blue line has gone up everywhere, which means that the pressure of technological change or globalization has been more or less felt equally in all rich countries. But at the second point, the blue line has not risen equally in all the countries because of the difference in policy response to the rising inequality. So what I wanted to say there is that actually where you have, call it objective forces of technological change and globalization on the one hand, one should not disregard also the political part of the process, which is addressing inequality. It does not mean that the political party alone might actually be able to do everything, but the political part should not be sort of disregarded altogether. So let me then move to the second part, which actually I really have to sort of skip many kind of full draft, but I don't have time. The second part, you remember in the beginning that I said global inequality is the combination of inequalities within nation states and between national inequality. So let me illustrate now how big is this between national inequality, because one of the points of the talk will be also to highlight the fact that if you take the entire global inequality, as I said, about 100, you will actually, when you decompose, you'll find that more than 2/3, or even depending on the decomposition criteria, even three quarters of global inequality are due to the differences in mean country incomes. That has many implications. It has a very important implication that what you might call global equality of opportunity doesn't exist because, or it's actually low, because a lot of your income will depend on where you were born. So in other words, if a person who is born in a poor country ends up with a stream of income which is low, and a person born in a rich country ends up in a stream of income which is high, that could be considered, if you really take a cosmopolitan point, you could consider that as an inequality of opportunity. In the same way that if you take nation states sort of as your kind of your field, then you can actually say that it is unfair that the person who is born, for example, in a poor county should end up always poorer than a person who is born to rich parents or in a rich county or rich state in the US. So let me illustrate how big are these between national inequalities, because they are also behind the migration movement. So what I do here is actually a nice graph, I think, where you actually, what you do the following. Let me explain for the US, you will see that for the other countries. You take income distribution in the US, and you put on a horizontal axis, you put people from the bottom, which is the lowest percentile, that's number 1, to the highest percentile, which is 100. 100 in this case would be this famous or infamous top 1%. And then on the vertical axis, you say, okay, fine, I know what is your income, so I take you, I calculate your income, and I say, okay, you are in the US, I suppose, at the median, which means you are exactly 50% of people are worse off than you, 50% are better. But does it tell me where are you in the global income distribution? And of course, it doesn't tell me unless or until I create this global income distribution the way that I explained in the very beginning, and then situate your position global. So what this graph does is actually start by looking at the Americans who are among the poorest in the US, who are like in the bottom 1%, 2%, or 3%. And when you put them in the global income distribution, as you can see on the vertical axis, they are above the 50th percentile. So in other words, somebody who is very poor in the U.S., who is actually at the bottom 1 or 2 or 3, is not rich, but actually okay globally, because he or she is about the median globally. And of course, everybody can go further to the right. Everybody else in the U.S. with, of course, on the 5th percentile, 10th percentile, median, or the very top, the top 5% is going obviously to be richer, so they would be also richer globally. And if you go at the very end, at the left, really, at the very end point of this graph, actually for you it's right, actually, the very end of this point, you would look, when you look at the top, you notice the flatness in the line, which actually indicates that 12% of the richest Americans are part of the global top 1%. In other words, it's easier to be part of the global top 1% than to be part of the U.S. top 1%. In other words, you need more income to be U.S. top 1% than global top 1%. Which is understandable because U.S. is a rich country, so if you compare yourself, your position to everybody else who is relatively rich, it's harder to be the richest guy of all than if you compare your position to the world. And then, let's see, for contrast, you think I could have taken many, and actually have many versions of this graph, but here I've taken India because it's a large country, an important country. So in the case of India, we are not surprised that the poorest Indians are also going to be among the poorest people in the world. What is actually interesting is that not enough Indian in statistical numbers are rich enough to be above the U.S. middle class or actually lower middle class income. Which doesn't mean that there are not billionaires in India. We read about them in the papers every day. You should realize that here each percentile, in the case of India, is 12 million people. So you have to have sufficiently large number of well-off Indians, which is actually like the whole population of Bombay, for example, to be actually, represented there in the top 1%. And whereas maybe you might have 1 million of rich Indians or 2 million, you don't have 12 million. So as you can see, actually, only about 15 to 20% of Indians are better off than really poorest people in the U.S. And then, of course, you can put other countries there, and this is for 2008. Things have changed because both India and China have grown, since then by, probably about 40%. So they have actually, these lines have gone up. The problem is that with household surveys, it takes us really 3 to 4 years to get the data because it's really a very slow process. And in the meantime, U.S., as you know, has not practically grown. So actually, the lines are probably now closer to the U.S. line, but the gaps are still enormous. And as you can see, China here, China has, of course, people who are towards the global top 1%, but it has also people who are very, very poor by world standards. And then I have here, for example, Russia, that you actually notice the sort of emergence of the middle class, people who are about 80th or 90th percentile. You also notice that the poorest people are, globally speaking, not that poor. And actually in Europe, it is very hard to find, whatever country you take, it's very hard to find people who are below 40th percentile. Like, for example, in rich European countries, even the poorest people there, like Denmark, are at the 80th percentile worldwide. And then a country that actually is very interesting, and I will not show you the name immediately because I will make you guess a little bit, is a country which, if you not look at the slide, which spans the world. So you have actually people there who are in the poorest percentiles in the country, but they are also among the poorest people in the world. You have sizable middle class, you have also upper middle class, these people around 80th, 90th percentile globally, and then you have people in the global top 1%. And clearly that has to be a country which is very unequal and which contains within itself both very, very poor people, significant middle class, and rich people. And there are a couple of countries like that. Of course, the best example is Brazil. But, I could have taken, for example, South Africa as well. It would have really kind of mimicked the same way that Brazil does. So this is just to give you an example of how huge are these differences. And of course, if I wanted to be even more extreme, I could show you a graph like this, where you compare Denmark with the number of African countries. And as you can see, actually, even in statistical significance in numbers, there are not enough Africans in those countries like Mali and Uganda to make it into an income which is above the income of the poorest people in Denmark. So these are really huge differences, and as I said before, they make about 80%, simply differences in mean income. They contribute to 80% of the global inequality. So, okay, so since I'm already actually at the end of my time, I have to show you one graph, which will be the last one, which actually really now combines within inequality and between inequality under the title of global inequality. Because I have not actually shown you how global inequality has moved over the last 50 years, or certainly not in the last 25 years or 30 years, to which we have migrated. But you might have already have some inkling if you think of the three main forces behind it. And the first one is what happens to within national inequalities. We have seen generally they have gone up. What happens to the poor countries? Is Africa catching up with the rich world? And that I didn't have the time to speak, but basically up to about 2000, no, Africa was falling behind the rich world. Since 2000, Africa is catching up, very modestly, but it's catching up. And then finally, the big question, which really determines a lot what happens to global inequality, is what is happening to the countries like India and China, which contain together like 2.5 billion people out of 7, because really growth in two countries is really crucial. And I would, in this graph, you can see actually basically what happened on global inequality with, of course, very imperfect data going back to 1800, but basically since the Industrial Revolution, global inequality measured again by the Gini coefficient has gone up. It's probably peaked around 1980s or 1990s, and now in the most recent period, because of the fact that China and India essentially, but also Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia are growing fast, whereas the rich world is not growing, global inequality has declined. So we have really there an interesting thing which seems puzzling at first, is that you have had generally rising inequality within nations, but because global inequality is not a result only of what happens within nations, but it's a result of what happens within nations, plus what happens to the growth rate of the poor and rich nations. High growth rates of China and India essentially have compensated for that, and we have slight decline, probably the first decline since the Industrial Revolution in the last 10 or 15 years. So we are in a very peculiar moment in history. I will not expand on that because I think there will be questions about that, but I would just finish with this peculiar moment. It's a real last slide that we have. And this is actually a reflection of what happened in the last 25 years. And here, and this is despite these political implications out in the title of my talk, is what you do here is a complex exercise where you put on the horizontal axis percentiles of global income distribution. Again, lowest would be at 1, the highest would be at 100, the richest in the world, 1% would be at 100. And then on the vertical axis, you look what happened to their real income between 1988 and 2008 or 2011 in the most recent version that I have. And then what you notice here, and this is my last point, is that largest percentage gains were around the median of the income distribution. These are not rich people by Western standards at all, but there was a large number of people who might kind of notionally call Chinese middle class, but these are actually people who are in the middle of the distribution of China, also people from India, Indonesia, and so forth. Like 90% of people there are from Asia. So you see, actually, they have doubled their real incomes over 20 years. Well, then the second point are people who actually have not seen much of the growth in their real income over that 20-year period. And I call them, for simplicity, U.S. lower middle class, but really includes mostly people. Actually, 80% of people there are from the rich countries, but from the lower part of the income distributions of the rich countries. And as you can notice, they are better off, obviously, than that so-called Asian middle class, but they have not seen any growth in income, whereas the Chinese middle class has seen significant increase or doubling. So that's my point B. The point A is that first, the China middle class. And then the point C is that you actually take the top 1% of people, and then you notice large increases in real income there. So that's kind of people who are in the global top 1% who have also seen a doubling of their real income. So this is really what basically you can say is the issue with which I think the world is going to deal, and we and you, in the last 25 years. It's a political issue, because the point A, I think, illustrates the issue of how China will deal with the rising aspiration of its middle class, demand for greater participation, maybe democracy and other issues, because we know historically that this has been a trend. Because when you have one large middle class, they actually ask for certain things which are beyond economics alone. Then the point B, I think, raises the issue how the rich countries will deal in the next 50 years with lack of growth among a significant chunk of their population. Because if you think that this is going to continue for another 25 or 30 years, clearly it would pose political issues of how to accommodate that lack of growth. And then the third point is, of course, the formation of what we can call something like global plutocracy, people who are in the global top 1% and who have actually seen very significant rises of their real income, and they may be very often divorced from their own countries, divorced in the sense that they have no connection with the countries where they come from. And they create maybe something which is like a new global government. So I would end it here. And I'm sure that actually this is the last slide, if you want to just have political implications. But I would be, of course, happy to answer any other questions from what I said before, or something that I didn't have time to speak about. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Let's open up to questions. Go ahead.
Said that bottom 1% in the U.S. is okay in other countries. What do you use to calculate that?
Let me answer this question, which is often asked. First, to calculate it simply based on income, because you calculate it from household surveys you get. And as I explained, you basically take income of the people who are poor, you take the income of the household, divide the number of people, and you get a number. But I know what you really need is that actually people often ask me, but isn't it unfair if you're really, I'm very, very poor in the U.S., I really feel extremely deprived and I'm really unhappy, and it's really, I don't really care if I'm above the median in the world. Which is true, you know. I'm not saying that people who are in rich countries and who are poor should not feel unhappy or, deprived or aspiring to much more. But when you work with actual numbers, one has to be also aware that their position is much higher than position of similar people, for example, in Africa or Asia. So it's not saying that, that poor people in rich countries should be just so happy that they are, in rich countries, they do actually feel that they should get more and that they don't get what they deserve. But when you put them globally, they put an opposite.
You do know that it's been said that a poor person in New York City is better off than a poor person.
Probably true also, yeah.
But it's still not. Yes.
I was just gonna say, so like the Gini coefficients in socialist countries, so the countries with the lowest Gini coefficients tend to be socialist countries like Norway and Denmark. So would you advocate more socialist policies to try to alleviate some of the inequality that's happening?
No, but that's a very good question. Actually, first of all, my work, as you have presented it, is what you can call positive. In that sense, I just go with numbers and I present you the results of them. Now, the second part of the work is when you come to recommendations and views. And I have not spoken about that today, and actually in my book I tend to not go too much into that. Let me then break your question into two. The countries that are with lowest level of inequality are essentially three types, three geographical areas. One is the Nordic countries that you mentioned. The second is actually interesting for some of the students of history, is actually the old Habsburg lands. Mainly because the countries have now become very small, but it's essentially Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, Slovenia are very low inequality. But they are small countries. Slovenia is 2 million people. And the third one is Taiwan, which is actually interesting because it's a country with relatively low inequality. Not as low as the other two groups, but with low inequality. Now, what I would advocate is, I think, a separate matter, because I don't think there is like one size fits all in the sense that you can apply exactly the same policies to all the countries. And we do see actually quite a lot of pressure on welfare states in the Nordic countries, partly because of migration. And we also see, it's a complicated topic, but we see also, as you might have seen, actually the right-wing parties that are in that sense very much for the continuation of the welfare state, but only for the citizens who were born Danish, but not for the migrants. So they're very interesting developments, I think, that we are seeing now in the Nordic countries, which might lead to, certainly, I think, some redesign of the typical welfare state in those countries.
Okay.
Have you found any correlation between economic equality, redistribution of income in countries and their growth rates, or other metrics of economic activity?
Well, that's an excellent question. That question has been studied. I have studied also recently that stuff. But that kind of a correlation or causality is really was studied in the 1990s a lot. It ended up with really non-conclusive results, partly because the data were such that actually they are extremely aggregated. You basically compare Gini coefficient, which is a very aggregated measure, with growth rate. And people have gotten all kinds of results, positive, negative. I will not go into that. Generally, they would find in the short term, they would find that greater inequality is positive for growth, inequality. But in the long term, that greater inequality is negative for growth. That actually negative effects of inequality kick in down the road. I think that the future research, which has now started, is really going to look, and I will not go into that, but it's to break inequality into two parts. Inequality due to sort of things which are bad for growth, like essentially, if you inherit position that is really not the result of your effort, it's actually a result of your circumstances, parental education, for example, race, gender. And if these elements are crucial in determining overall inequality, we have some empirical results that the countries, or actually states within the United States, grow more slowly. If most of inequality is due to effort, which means actually everything else which you cannot ascribe to what is given to you essentially at birth, then we find results that there is a negative correlation between inequality and growth. In other words, high inequality is bad for growth.
More questions. Go ahead.
Do you count stocks and investments in your calculation when you're calculating inequality?
Which was the first one? Do I count what? Stocks. Okay. Good, very good question. I don't. This is as a disposable income of households. So it's actually income is all the inflows, receipts that you have received over a year, generally. And if you have investment income, yes, it is included there. So your investment income is included, but not the total stock. So, for example, if I own today, stock worth, $100, what would come into my calculation would be simply what was the return on this stock. So if this year I got 3%, I would count only $3. So that's what income is. It's actually what you have received within that year. So the answer to your question, yes, actually investment, the returns from investments are included.
Okay, all right.
Based on the Gini graph, which show that countries such as Mexico and Brazil have decreased inequality, can you elaborate more on the factors that have caused it to decrease in inequalities, and will it continue to decrease at the same rate?
Well, it's also an excellent question. This has been studied a lot with respect to Brazil. That's what I'm familiar with. And for Brazil, we have three forces that have led to the decline in inequality. The first one, many of you might know, really vast program of what is called conditional cash transfer, which means that actually each family, which is below a certain level, and it's very big because about 40 to 50 million Brazilians qualify for that program. They receive money on their debit card and every month by the government, but they do have to make sure that their kids go to school and get vaccinated. So that's the conditional part of cash transfer. So that has obviously reduced poverty and reduced inequality. Then there was the second element, which was the historically increase in education levels in Brazil. So Brazil was a country that maybe 20 years ago had an average 5 years of education, and now it's at 8 years. There was a really massive expansion. That has reduced the wage differentials between highly skilled and low skilled people. So that of course contributed to reducing inequality. And the third one is a significant increase in the minimum wage. So there are really three things in Brazil. And if you kind of look at each of them individually, you have two things which are policy related, cash transfers and minimum wage. And then you had one thing which was really essentially development related. Brazil became a more developed country. And while these other two policies were introduced under the socialist government of Lula, the first one with the expansion of education was in the previous government by Cardoso. So, it is Brazil was very lucky in the sense that it had good confluence of both policies and development. A little bit to work it like a goodness curve would expect you to do that.
Do you think in Mexico it might be labor migrants?
I know less about Mexico. It could be, obviously Mexico also has a large cash transfer program because actually like all Latin American countries now have. There was some talk about New York actually using that the same. And what is interesting there, I'll stop there, is actually this is in my studies and in many other people, this is like the first kind of a, how should I say, social innovation practically that comes from the south to the north. Generally speaking, these innovations in the way that society is organized, we have social transfer, social security started in Germany in 1880. You have unemployment benefits started in rich countries. Generally speaking, it spreads from a rich country to a poorer country. But this is interesting. The cash transfers really started in Latin America. They have spread to a couple of countries in Africa. And actually, even there was consideration to have them in New York. And I believe actually they would eventually, in some form or another, actually even spread to the rich countries.
Do we have any more questions from students? Get one more to sit it down. We'll turn it back.
Yeah, this is a question relating to the last one with respect to Brazil. I know there's a lot of factors going on with Brazil with the contracting economy, the real being the worst performing currency, also, slumpy commodity prices, as well as like single-digit approval for President Rousseff. Do you see them, towards the next 5 to 10 years heading back towards above the line, or do you still think that the trends are still there to be below the line, as we've seen in the past 25 years?
Well, it's a very difficult question. I was actually thinking about it. It's very difficult to tell because, of course, Brazil. Let me just put it like that. One should not be, how should I say? In my work, should not be focused only on what happened like in the past 6 months. In soccer, it is called, maybe actually in football as well, it's called the commentator's curve, because very often commentators just say, oh, this guy is really doing horribly, and then bang, this guy scores a goal within the next minute. So, if you just focus on what happened last 6 months, we are really talking about here longer term trends. However, all the things that you mentioned for Brazil are negative. And Brazil is now going into really significant decline of real income. It pushes, there is already a pressure to sort of reduce the extent of the distribution program, which is about 0.5% of GDP, but it's still costly. And with political instability, with corruption, with possible new impeachment and new elections, I think it's going to have definitely negative impact obviously on growth, but it could also have in the next a few years negative impact on inequality. But I really think that on the other hand, these things that I've talked about here today are really longer term. So I would not be surprised that after 2 or 3 years, these things in Brazil kind of go back to where they are now.
Can you take a couple more?
Yes, yes.
Okay, Dr. Jane.
In your mind, what course of action the government should take to reduce inequality, which is action which is politically feasible and contribute to economic growth?
You mean within the United States?
Yeah, okay.
Well, I think I don't know, the U.S. is a difficult case, which is the most studied case, and actually, if you ask me, I see in the U.S. many forces for the rising inequality in the following 10 years or 20 years, many more than forces for the decrease in inequality. And let me just go very by title. What are the forces that I see for the rise in inequality? And actually, it's not me. Actually, people have written about that. First of all, is rising share of capital incomes, which I've seen this. Actually, the labor share has been on the decline. So the capital incomes, when they rise, the problem is not that they rise as such. The problem is that people who receive capital incomes are generally rich people. So, people who have large share of their income from ownership of assets are rich. So that feeds into rising income inequality. So that's one element that I see there. The second element is an interesting phenomenon, which in itself is not bad, but you see actually at the very top of the income distribution in the U.S. and other rich countries, but in the U.S. more so, you see people who are both have also high labor income. Now, when you have a situation that you have in the top 1% people also with high labor incomes and high capital incomes, it is more difficult to make a case that you should actually be very forceful in reducing incomes on the top, because there is a certain meritocratic element there. So that actually limits, I think, popular support for policies that would be very aggressive towards higher tax rates, imposing tax rates on the very top. And the third element, which is very interesting, actually I've got 5 of them there, but these are the 3 most important, is an element which received some attention recently, and many of students here may be actually sort of interested in that, is so-called, and that element is going to work itself out through the system, but it's not at the end. It's so-called assortative mating. And it's the fact that actually people with high education and high potential incomes tend to intermarry. So that, again, is not something that the government can do much about it. I mean, it's a reflection of the fact that 50 years ago, you had relatively few women in the labor force, and now you have many more of them. As you know, actually, there are more graduates for women than men these days. And then what happens is people's preferences are such that they intermarry. So you have lots of couples with very high income. Again, that's not something the government can do. The government cannot ban you to marry somebody who actually wants to get married to. And so that, again, I think, limits it. Now, going back to the question, like, what can you, and finally, that the rich, of course, have a disproportionate effect on the political system. So after all of that negative or pessimistic view, what the government can do, there are small things that people have been talking, it is expansion, higher tax rates, one possibility, but the effects I don't think are going to be very big on that. Education is a very important one. But, rich countries have also reached a very high level of number of years of average education. So what you are going to get from that is relatively limited. And, expansion of programs like EITC and things like that. But, I really see that the number of feasible policy options in the U.S. to reduce inequality is relatively limited. And assuming, of course, that globalization continues, we have seen people now arguing against transatlantic TPP and so on, but, I don't think that politically this is going to go very far. So I'm relatively pessimistic.
All right, well, one more question. Hold on. Okay.
Besides the U.S., on the global and international level, what do you think we take to increase inequality?
No, you see, global is actually different from national. National, for example, I said a little bit about the U.S. That I'm pessimistic there. But global is an entirely different story, because global depends a lot, or to a large extent, what happens to the growth rate of the poor country. And there on global, ironically, the best advice you can give is there are actually 2 advice on global level. One is faster growth of large, populous, that is, relatively poor countries. So essentially, high growth rates in India, China, and then in Africa, in Ethiopia, Sudan. Really, the countries that are poor need really to grow fast. The second policy, which is kind of obvious technically, but politically very difficult, is migration. Because migration is fundamentally, that's important to realize, is fundamentally not different from high growth rates in poor countries. In one case, increased income work for people who stay in one place. In another case, people get higher income by moving to another place. But obviously, political implications are entirely different. And that's why we have a backlash of large migration into Europe and backlash against it, and maybe some similar situation in the US. But really, technically, they are the same. But it is obviously politically much better in poor countries where to have high growth rate or higher growth rate than the rich countries.
Okay, so we have to stop now because I see people anxious and there's a class,
Yeah.
and we need to give some time our speakers to rest. By the way, food is in room 212. And before we go, we have a symbolical gift to remember
thank you very much.
here. Thank you very much. All right, room 212, it's all yours.
If anyone here is to sign up for
And
any
remember to
professor,
sign up for the Econ Finance Society. You're always welcome to our sheet. If it's a requirement.
Yes.
Pretty good. So crazy. Yeah. Yeah.
I emailed about that.
Don't worry about it. She told Sarah told me about it now.
Yes.
I did not see much of it, did not hear much of it.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the point.
I don't.
My name is Young Back. I'm sorry. I